One of the greatest obstacles to crafting health and wellness is identifying and controlling inflammation. It's at the core of all complex and chronic diseases, and it's the driving mechanism that underlies the most common symptoms that people like you struggle to overcome. Join us as we explore cutting-edge science and research to give you the information and tools you need to create the quality of life you want and deserve. And now, here is the host of Inflammation Nation, Dr. Stephen Noseworthy.
Hey guys, welcome back. Last episode, we talked a little more detail about the thyroid system as part of the hierarchy of functional health that we've been talking about. And I shared some top-level insights, like how thyroid conditions are more common in middle-aged women than men. But literally anyone at this point can become hypothyroid and have some kind of a thyroid condition. We also talked about how there's far more low thyroid or hypothyroid conditions than there are hyper or high thyroid conditions. And I reminded you once again that thyroid is a system. It's not just the gland, and that your thyroid hormones, they don't work in isolation. They affect and are affected by many other things. And so just because you have a normal level of thyroid hormones on your labs does not guarantee that you're going to have normal thyroid hormone function, right? It's not just about the levels. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, we have to recognize that the vast majority of thyroid conditions are caused by an underlying autoimmune reaction called Hashimoto's hypothyroidism. So the truth is, again, if you're on thyroid meds because you've been diagnosed with hypothyroidism, there's about a 95% chance that the root cause that's causing that is your immune system. And such that if you're on thyroid meds but you still have unresolved thyroid symptoms, you need to start focusing on your immune system and not just on finding the right medication or the right dosing. So what does it look like to have unresolved thyroid symptoms? Well, some combination of fatigue, perhaps some weight gain that you can't lose, cold hands and feet, sometimes hair loss, the need for more sleep than, say, the average person to be able to function, loss of motivation, maybe even full on depression, and very commonly brain fog. And you don't have to have all of them, just persistence of some of them, especially despite taking thyroid medications and perhaps having normal thyroid labs like we've talked about. And that last point is actually worth exploring just a little bit because it's very common for people to be confused. Like, how is it I can be on thyroid meds and have quote unquote normal thyroid labs, but I still have thyroid symptoms? So let's go through a couple of different reasons. The first thing to realize is that that list that I just gave you, the fatigue, the brain fog, the cold intolerance, and so on, they can be coming from other things, from other systems. So maybe you're thinking, or what you're thinking of as unresolved thyroid symptoms, or maybe coming from something else, like some other unrecognized or perhaps poorly managed problem. And the most common ones that can create these similar thyroid-like symptoms are things like blood sugar and your adrenals. And in fact, insulin resistance or metabolic syndrome is commonly called the great thyroid mimic because it can create all the very same list of symptoms that we ascribe to thyroid in hypothyroid conditions. You know, the lesson is that what we view as a constellation of thyroid symptoms are not unique to the thyroid, right? Which means we have to be open to considering that maybe your unresolved thyroid symptoms are actually coming from somewhere else. But let's assume for the moment that the unresolved thyroid symptoms are actually unresolved thyroid symptoms and not something else. And let's assume for the moment that you're on thyroid medications that do work for you and you do have normal labs. The question then becomes, how can you have normal labs and unresolved thyroid symptoms that are truly coming from your thyroid? And that's the million dollar question, right? I can't remember the guy's name, but I've quoted him in some of the seminars that I've taught. But there's a recent past president of the American Thyroid Association that went on record saying something like 50% of people on thyroid meds who have a normal TSH value still have unresolved thyroid symptoms, and they have no idea why, right? And that was kind of the gist of his statement. Well, once you understand what I'm going to share today, you're going to have a better general understanding than most medical doctors out there that are working with people who have thyroid issues. And I promise you that. What I want to do is give you two frameworks that are going to help you organize your thinking about your thyroid system, And I've kind of already teased around the edges of the first framework, which is how we think about the system, right? The second framework then is how to organize your thoughts about what you discover in the framework. The first framework relates to how the system is designed and how it operates. And this is one area where the medical community unfortunately fails. And it's simply because they focus only on one part of one aspect of the entire framework, right? Your average medical doctor is going to focus on mainly two lab tests, your TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, and T4. And maybe there's some more advanced docs that will look at the free T4 levels as well. That's better, but not sufficient to assess the entire system. So here's the first framework. We have to see the thyroid system in terms of production capacity, processing, and what we call proteomic potential. And all I'm going to do is describe this to you so that you see it, but please understand that it takes me a couple of hours in any given seminar to bring a group of doctors through this framework so that they get it. All we're doing here is sketching out the framework. There are many details that maybe a doctor needs that you don't necessarily. So let's break that down, right? We have production, we have processing, and then we have proteomics. And I'll define that when we get there. So the production part of the framework looks at how your brain talks to your thyroid gland and how your thyroid gland responds by either increasing or decreasing your thyroid hormone output. And this is what your MD is checking when he or she is measuring your TSH and T4. That's how we assess thyroid production, by measuring TSH, measuring T4. So if you want to know if you're hypothyroid or hyperthyroid, that's what you need, TSH and T4. It's also how your medical doctor or your prescribing doctor determines if you need more or less thyroid hormone dosing if you're on thyroid meds. And it goes very simply just like this. If you're not on thyroid meds and your TSH is elevated and your T4 is low, then you get diagnosed with hypothyroidism. And generally, they're going to say you need to go on synthetic T4 medication to replace what you're not producing. If you're already on thyroid meds and your TSH goes up, they're probably going to increase your dose. And if TSH is very, very low, they might back off a little, especially if you're showing signs of overstimulation. Things like a rapid heart rate, feeling nervous or jittery inside, sweating attacks, insomnia. That's like classic picture of overstimulation from too much thyroid medication. Now, there are nuances that doctors and clinicians need to know, but that's the basics, right? The production part of the framework is about whether or not you're making or taking enough thyroid hormones. And the most common reason why people have a production problem is Hashimoto's hypothyroidism. But if you remember in previous episodes, T4, which is what your thyroid gland makes and what most people on medication are taking, is not biologically active. And so that T4 needs to be converted into some balance of both active T3 hormone and inactive reverse T3 hormone. You might remember that this conversion process happens predominantly in the liver. And so the T4 hormones that you are either making or taking have to be processed by the liver to become active and to give you some potential to stimulate your thyroid receptors in your cells, in fact, all of your cells. And most processing errors are caused by inflammation and stress chemistry. There are some key nutrients that work here, things like selenium and iron, but by and large, inflammation and stress or stress chemistry are the key players that give you processing problems. So we produce thyroid hormones and then we process them into active forms. And then the next step in the process is to have those active T3 hormones bind to your thyroid receptors in your cells to turn on their metabolic machinery. And this is what we call proteomic activation or proteomic potential. The word proteomic literally refers to making proteins, and basically it's a fancy way of saying cellular activation. And in the same manner that stress and inflammation affect the processing part of this first framework, they also impair how your cells respond to your active T3 hormones. In other words, stress and inflammation, for lack of a better way of saying it, jam the T3 signal at the cell and prevent good working hormones from doing their job. And this is the reason why someone can be on thyroid meds even have normal TSH and T4 levels on their labs, and yet still have unresolved thyroid symptoms. It's because there is a source of inflammation and or stress chemistry in the body that's preventing the cells from responding properly. So you really don't need to be confused if you do have unresolved thyroid symptoms and you're on thyroid meds. It either means that the symptoms are coming from somewhere else and they're not really coming from the thyroid system, or more commonly, you have a problem with thyroid hormone processing or proteomic responses. And again, the main causes of that are some form of stress chemistry and or inflammation. And of course, it doesn't tell us where it is or how many of those sources you have. And that's the process of investigation within a functional medicine paradigm, is to figure all that stuff out. It's probably a good time to remember that the root cause of almost thyroid conditions is autoimmunity, right? Which is by its very nature pro-inflammatory. And so the goal is to find and fix any and all sources of inflammation to resolve those unresolved symptoms. So that first framework in the two frameworks that we're going to review today is production, processing, and proteomic or cellular responses. That's how we think about the system, how we determine where the problems are. The second framework, I like to call the four pillars of, let's call it the four pillars of resolving thyroid symptoms or resolving unresolved thyroid symptoms. But in either case, let's just call it the four pillars. And what I'm doing is I'm actually giving you a sneak preview of a new learning program that I created just for this reason, right? To give you some practical action steps to follow to do the best you can for yourself, because your medical doctor is not going to share this with you, mainly because they haven't learned it themselves. And when I say things like that, I kind of feel compelled to tell you that I don't think your medical doctors are stupid. I don't think your medical doctors are intentionally withholding information. They just don't have it to give. It's not their deal. It's not how they think. They can only do what they know. They can only do what they think. And if you think or do things differently, then you have other options. So here's the second framework, and this is the action part, right? The first framework is how to understand the nature of your thyroid problems, if you have it. The second framework is about what to do about what you understand. And so the four pillars of unresolved thyroid or resolving your thyroid symptoms are as follows. First, you have to find the right thyroid medication for you. Second, you have to forge your ideal diet. Third, you have to fix your immune triggers. And fourth, you have to focus on long-term immune competence and control. So the second framework is, and obviously I'm using all F words, not the bad F words, but F words nonetheless, right? The framework is find, forge, fix, and focus. So let's chat quickly about each of these pillars so you have a general idea of what this framework and that program is all about. First of all, finding the right medication for you can be a little bit tricky. The first thing that you need to know is that there are three camps when it comes to thyroid meds, right? Your MD is most likely in the first camp, and that's the one that says that the only trustworthy and effective thyroid medication is synthetic T4, something like Synthroid or levothyroxine. In this first synthetic T4 only medication camp, there are some underlying assumptions. The first assumption is that natural or bioidentical thyroid hormones are inferior because they're not standardized. And this is patently untrue, right? These meds have been standardized for a couple of decades now. But perhaps the worst assumption that this camp makes, this synthetic T4 only camp, is that everyone has a perfect ability to process or convert the T4 medication into biologically active T3. Remember the processing part of the first framework. You have to take the T4 you're making or taking in a pill form and convert it into something else for it to actually have an impact at your cellular level. And so docs that are in this first camp of synthetic T4 only basically make the assumption that you have perfect capacity to process. Or to say it another way, you either don't have a genetic problem with it or you don't have stress or inflammation in your body that could change how that processing works. Now, so when you swallow something like Synthroid, again, you're trusting your body that you can convert it into bioidentical T3, which is what your cells need to function. Not always the case, of course. But remember that when you take your source material of T4 hormone, you convert that into both active T3, but also some quantity of reverse T3, which basically opposes active T3 at the cellular level. And so ultimately, at the end of the day, not everyone has the same capacity to take synthetic T4 meds and process them into what they need. And like, granted, some people take Synthroid levothyroxine and it fixes a lot of things for them. These people theoretically would be better at processing than others who take these medications, but they still have unresolved thyroid symptoms. And what this means is that some people need not just T4 in their medications, but sometimes they need some T3 as well. And that might mean adding some T3 from a synthetic source. So it's not unusual for a prescribing medical doctor or a DO or a nurse practitioner to give someone not just levothyroxine, but also to put them on something like Cytomel. So they're getting two different medications, a synthetic T4 as well as a synthetic T3. Or maybe you have someone who's a little bit more integrative and functional in their thought process, and they opt for some combination of T3 and T4 in a bioidentical form, something like Armour or maybe Westhroid, where you have both together. And that brings me to the second camp as it relates to finding the right thyroid medication. The second camp is the one that says that natural or bioidentical combinations of T3 and T4 are always better than synthetic T4 only medications. And this is preferred by many providers who have a natural bent, and people like you who might value the idea or the concept of natural is better than synthetic. And listen, there is case after case after case of someone going from synthetic things like Synthroid to a bioidentical like Armour. And I'm not promoting either one. I'm just telling you what's happening. So there's many cases of people going from the synthetic T4 like Synthroid to Armour or something similar and doing much better, much better. So camp number one on the meds issue is synthetic T4 only, and camp number two is bioidentical T3 and T4 only. But what if I told you that some people who go from synthetic T4s like Synthroid and Levo to a bioidentical combination crash and burn, and they only stabilize when they go back to those evil synthetic medications, right? It happens. And this gives rise to the third camp, which is where I am. And that third camp says that the issue is not really synthetic versus natural. It's not even really about T4 only versus T3 and T4 together, but it's about whatever medication is best matched to you and your physiology. Which one is best matched to you and the problems that you find when you look at things through that first framework. So what mixture of production or processing or proteomic errors are in play? And that's why two people with similar complaints will have different responses and outcomes to the same medication and the same dosing. So finding the right medication is not just about that magic dose of T4, but to match the medication to you as an individual person. The key factor here to consider is not just the nature of the medication, but whether or not you have one or both of the major processing errors. That is, whether or not you're properly converting T4 in your medication efficiently into the proper balance of T3 and reverse T3. So finding the right medication it's more about you than it is about the medication itself. So that's the first pillar, find the right medication for you. The second pillar is about forging your ideal diet. Now, I did an entire series on this earlier, and this is the very first thing that I do with all of the clients that I take on in my one-on-one coaching practice. We always start with diet. Unfortunately, there's a lot of natural practitioners that put more emphasis on giving people nutritional supplements than they do on the diet or nutrition itself. And I'll repeat something I've said many times before on this podcast, and I will continue to say it, is that you can't out-supplement a bad diet, right? And since I've already gone through this in detail in other episodes, I'm just going to hit the highlights, maybe add some additional tidbits. Forging your ideal diet is about picking a good starting point and then modifying that starting point to suit your individual needs. And what that means is, whether you're a fan of primal or paleo or keto or whatever the case might be, you can take that as a template, but you're probably going to have to tweak some things to make it work for you, right? And so in doing this, I focus on a few things. I focus on, number one, on food content or diet content. We talk about quantity of food, like how many calories, protein, fat, carbohydrates in terms of macronutrients. Talk about food quality, and we talk about timing and frequency of meals. Like, should I be fasting intermittently? Should I be eating 5 small meals throughout the day? There's many different options in terms of putting these variables together. So the first thing I start with is diet content, which we typically talk about foods to eat and foods to avoid. And there are several reasons that you might want to avoid any given food. Some foods are just generally pro-inflammatory, and they have more potential than others to trigger an inflammatory response. All you have to do is think about the standard American diet. It's very pro-inflammatory. However, some foods have more of a tendency to blow your blood sugar control, which, if you remember, is number 2 on the functional hierarchy of health. But you also have to think about food sensitivities and food allergies if you have them. And finally, some foods can potentially cross-react with your thyroid. They can cross-react with human tissue. And so we'll talk about that and how it relates to your thyroid. But first, let me define cross-reactivity if this is an unfamiliar term to you. Cross-reactivity with your immune system is when 2 things look enough alike at a molecular level that your immune system can't tell the difference between them and reacts as if they were the same, right? The principle for this, for some of you listening, is when you eat certain foods, your immune system is going to attack your thyroid. It doesn't happen with everyone. It is a probable problem or a potential problem, but it's not a guarantee that everyone with a thyroid problem is going to eat certain foods, and have their thyroid attacked. Some people will, some people won't. Back in 2017, in the Journal of Thyroid Research, they published a study that was actually done by 2 friends and colleagues of mine, Drs. Tatis Karazian and Dr. Aristo Vigidani. And in that study, that they took purified proteins from 204 foods that we commonly eat, and they checked to see if any of them cross-reacted with several different elements of the thyroid system. And all of these foods are on what we call the paleo diet. And the reason why I point that out is because there are a lot of people on their own initiating a paleo diet, or a lot of doctors recommending paleo diet, as I commonly do, for people with thyroid conditions. Yet up until 2017, we had no idea that some of the foods that are okay on the paleo diet could be problematic for some people with things like Hashimoto's hypothyroidism. So what they did in the study is they looked at some of the proteins in the foods on the paleo diet, and they checked whether or not they were cross-reacting with TSH, T3, and T4, the key enzyme involved in converting T4 to T3. That's called deiodinase, if you care to know. And they checked a couple more things. And so let me make sure that you're clear on the concept here. Like, let's say you have a thyroid problem, and that's probably due to thyroid autoimmunity. You may or may not know that you have Hashimoto's hypothyroidism. If you eat certain foods, there's a chance that when you do, your immune system will react against some part of your thyroid system. And in this paper, the most common targets were actually the T3 and T4 hormones themselves, the very things that you need to get optimal cell activation, right? And honestly, the list is too long for me to describe here, but what I'll do is I'll put a link in the description that when you click it, you can go online, you can actually download the full paper and read it if you care to, and you can see the list of potentially reactive foods that are there for you. And again, just to be clear, with cross-reactivity, this is about potential or probability, not certainty. It doesn't mean that everyone who eats a given food will have their thyroid or their T3 or their T4 attacked. It does not mean that. It just means for some people, this is going to be a problem. So the list might have a couple of dozen foods. And again, even if you are somebody who is cross-reacting, it doesn't mean you're going to cross-react with all of them. Right? There's a high degree of individual variability here, but it's a new dimension of the thought process of how we create or forge ideal diets for individual people. We might be able to sit back and say that over large populations, the paleo diet is a very good starting point, and a lot of people, again, in large populations who adopt that diet as part of their lifestyle will probably do quite well. But when we zoom down to each individual person, that's where the individualization needs to happen, because what applies to large groups of people doesn't always apply to the individual. But listen, if you have been stressing over why you still have thyroid symptoms and everything else seems to be in place and you're eating a good, clean, maybe a paleo diet, maybe this is an avenue of exploration for you. But let me give you a few things here to whet your appetite. I hope you go and download the paper and take a look at that. So here's the short list of things. Some of these things might shock you. You're probably not going to want to hear it, and that's okay. The foods that have the most potential to cross-react with your T3 and T4 hormones are these. I'm just going to go through the list. I'm not even going to pause and talk about them. Number 1, tuna. Number 2, nuts like almonds, cashews, and Brazil nuts, including peanuts and peanut butter. Coffee, corn, egg yolk, cow's milk, oats, orange juice, potato, quinoa, scallops, seaweed, shrimp, gluten-free soy sauce, squid, and tofu. Those are the ones that have the greatest potential for any individual person to cross-react with T3 and T4 hormones and completely change how their system is working despite having normal thyroid labs. Now, I know many of you are eating foods on this list, and I have to stress that this concept of cross-reactivity is not a guarantee, meaning just because we know it can happen doesn't mean it will happen for you. But if you've done everything else that you can think of, and perhaps you need to consider the potential for certain foods cross-reacting with your T3 and T4 hormones. What does that mean? Ultimately, it destroys the hormones, or at the very least attaches antibodies to them so that they can't bind to your receptors and do what those hormones are supposed to do. All right, that's pillar number 2, forging your ideal diet. And the concept of cross-reactivity is one of several different elements of doing that. Now, I hope you go back and listen to the Forging Your Ideal Diet series, the mini-series that I did in the podcast. Pillar number 3, obviously this is going to be a longer episode today. Pillar number 3, fix your immune triggers. This is a huge one. And it's really what this entire podcast is about. It's about finding and fixing sources of inflammation that change your physiology and affect the quality of your life. So here's the connection. Once we know or strongly suspect that your thyroid problems are rooted in autoimmunity, the game no longer becomes just about finding the right thyroid medication and dosing. That's important, and it's also why finding the right dose or the right medication is pillar number 1. We have to start there. But if that's all we do, we miss numerous opportunities to affect positive changes. And if you have unrecognized or poorly managed inflammatory triggers, these will continue to ramp up, or at the very least sustain your autoimmune reactivity. And peeling away these layers of inflammation and immune triggers will offload your immune system so that it can start to quiet down and things will start to function more efficiently. In fact, when you look at the list of things that can drive inflammation, it starts to look an awful lot like our functional hierarchy of health, because everything that we've talked about, from your anemias to blood sugar control to your adrenals and stress chemistry to gut health, all of these things have one thing in common, and that is inflammation. So suffice it to say that the more immune triggers that you can find and fix or modify and control, the better off you will be and the better your entire thyroid system should work. That's pillar number 3, find and fix your immune triggers. And that brings me to the final pillar, pillar number 4, which is focus on long-term immune control or immune competence. And honestly, this weaves all of the other pillars together and puts them into a long-term consequence. Like I tell people all the time that all of the health issues that we help them find are important to fix in and of themselves. So if someone has a blood sugar, we want to fix that because blood sugars are not a good thing. If someone's got a gut problem or an adrenal dysfunction, we need to fix them for their own sake. But when we understand that these things have an inflammatory component and have great potential to dysregulate their autoimmune control, then there's another reason to fix those problems. It's because they contribute to an unstable immune system or a dysfunctional immune system, however you want to express that. So we want to help them find and fix those problems because they're important in their own right. But the most important thing for their longevity and their long-term quality of life is to keep the focus on the immune system. Keep it there, right on the immune system. It honestly, it does no good to find the right thyroid medication or have normal thyroid labs, yet have unresolved thyroid symptoms, because the underlying autoimmunity being driven by persistent immune triggers is still perpetuating immune dysregulation. This is going to have a long-term cost. And so anyone on this journey of becoming healthier and regaining quality of life that they've lost, it's about splitting your focus between the here and now. How do I make some short-term changes that help me gain control of my physiology and maybe control my short-term symptomatology? But how do I do it? How do I do that in such a way that my long-term quality of life and health continues to get better, right? So it's a split focus, short-term as well as long-term. So buckle down, do the work, but keep your eyes on the horizon, because ultimately at the end of the day, you want to be healthy in another 15 or 20 years. Okay, that is a wrap for today's episode and the thyroid aspect of the functional hierarchy of health. Before I sign off again, let me just remind you, I have my 4 pillars of thyroid health program. It's a new course that I've created, goes into much deeper detail. Today was just a flyby and a top-level overview. There's a lot more to learn, a lot more to know. And so I'll put a link in my description. There's one there that directs you straight to my online store. And if you feel like that would help you, then please hit that link and check out the course. It's quite reasonably priced. And also, while you're at it, hit that subscribe button and share this episode with everybody that you know. When we come back, we're going to talk about the next part of our functional hierarchy of health, and that's cardiovascular health. And we're going to start with something called the cholesterol myth. Stay tuned, guys, and thanks for listening.